Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
I'm with Ambassador Deepa Gopalan Wadhwa, former ambassador to Qatar from 2009 to 12, and former ambassador to the UAE, Ambassador Navdeep Suri in the UAE from 2016 to 19. Both of you keen watchers, observers, experts on the Gulf, on West Asia, Middle East, whatever you want to call it. Welcome to The Print. Today we are discussing how the Middle East is changing. It's being reframed with Qatar back into the fold, much more normalized relations in the Middle East with Qatar. Ambassador Wadhwa, may I ask you first, you served in Qatar for about a decade ago. What do you make of the other Arab nations led by Saudi Arabia, the UAE, welcoming Qatar back into the fold?
Well, Jyoti, considering this was actually issue of their making, and you know, they have after 3.5 years welcomed Qatar back, and I don't know whether any of those 13 demands, which were then shrunk to 6 at some point of time, that they wanted Qatar to agree to, have actually been fulfilled in any sort of way. But there is, I think, the geopolitics of the region, and also I do believe that this really has been hastened because of the changes far away in Washington, and you know, and I think that is what has really brought these countries together. Very interesting that they're back, but I must also say that I must say a word of caution that yes, there has been some sort of rapprochement at the last GCC meeting just held a couple of days ago. But does this really mean the end of all the issues or the problems that they have with Qatar, the other forum had with Qatar? I'm not so sure. Because in 2014, there was a similar agreement. And in 2017, it again came up in the open, the entire whatever disputes they were, so to speak. And then we had this blockade of 3.5 years. So we've got to really wait and watch what happens. But I think what is interesting, this entire thing, is to see that Qatar didn't blink.
So, Ambassador Navdeep Suri, we are talking about how the Middle East is being reframed. Now, this tiny little sheikhdom or little kingdom called Qatar, barely 4 million people, what is it about Qatar that makes the rest of the Arab world so nervous? I mean, is it Al Jazeera? What is it? After all, tell us.
I think when you're the world's largest gas producer, and that translates into lots of billions of dollars, it can buy you a lot of influence to start with.
No, but Saudi Arabia is perhaps, you know, has much more money, much more oil. The Saudis,
in a sense, I had a kind of a ringside view on it when I was in Cairo as ambassador,
yes.
Because I think that's where some of this really started. You know, the Egyptians chose Mohammed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood as their first democratically elected president. And Qatar gave wholehearted support, including something like a $25 billion aid package. But from the Saudi and UAE perspective, they saw this political Islam, the rise of political Islam in the form of the Muslim Brotherhood, as the starting point of a very slippery slope. And they said, if this was to come to our shores, you know, where's the Saudi legitimacy then in terms of the country that represents or claims to represent Islam? So, you know, you had an ideological divide where Qatar, for reasons of its own, chose to put its financial muscle behind the political Islam in Egypt, in Tunisia, in other places. And the UAE sort of took the lead in opposing it. And in Egypt's case, actually supported General Sisi and the security establishment. And within a year, they brought Morsi down. So, you know, they have good reason to fear Qatar's flirtation with the Islamic groups, and not just in terms of financial support, but Al Jazeera as the most influential media outlet in the Arab world, particularly the Arabic language version of Al Jazeera, not the English that we see here, right. Has really offered a platform to some of the most reactionary individuals. Yusuf Qaradawi, for example, the Egyptian cleric, is given a platform on Al Jazeera, and this scares the more conservative governments.
This, you know, it's interesting that you say that Al Jazeera is giving religious clerics or fundamentalist right-wing Islamists a platform. But I would say to you, Ambassador Wadhwa, that if you have a big network like this, it's a very powerful network. They've imported a lot of Western journalists. I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it, that in the heart of the Arab world, you have this tiny little sheikhdom with this big, very influential network. So how did the sheikhs leverage Al Jazeera to expand their own influence?
Very interesting, Jyoti, because Al Jazeera really, as Navdeep says, has been one of the primary irritants in that region. Of course, it was set up, I think,
sorry to interrupt you, but in what way is it an irritant? Sorry to interrupt.
No, I'll tell you why, exactly. But I'll tell you exactly what it was. Because what happened was that, generally the policy, first of all, Al Jazeera was set up, I think, with Western, certainly with the US help and so on. But and they did hire, as you said, the best from the BBC and the CNN from everywhere all over the world, and seemed to be this really breath of freedom, of press freedom in that part of the world. But there were very, very clear lines, and the lines were that you can criticize everybody around as long as you don't criticize the regime at home. And as Navdeep does say, that it really did give a platform to people like Qaradawi. Of course, Qaradawi of the Muslim Brotherhood, it goes back a little bit because, when the Muslim Brotherhood was expelled from Egypt, they found a home in Qatar. And when I was there, Qaradawi was a very influential player over there. So using Al Jazeera, one was, and particularly the Arabic version, I mean, they could get out versions of their stories across the Arabic world. And I do remember, even in the case of India, it was a reason for some irritation in our relations because of the coverage that Al Jazeera did of Gujarat riots and Kashmir. Mm-hmm. So yes, Al Jazeera has been the cause of a lot of problems between the countries, including the periodic recall of ambassadors. When I was there in Qatar, the Saudi ambassador had just returned after being away for about 4 or 5 years. And so this kept happening. There would be some Al Jazeera broadcasts that they didn't like, and then the neighbors would pull back their ambassadors, and then there would be some problem. So Al Jazeera really has been one of the main reasons. And again, I understand the last couple of days it has toned down, not only they, but also the Saudi press has kind of toned down the anti-Qatar and anti-Saudi propaganda. But I don't know how long this will last.
So, Ambassador Suri, MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia, welcomed, very publicly, very warmly, went to receive the Sheikh of Qatar at the summit a couple of days ago, earlier this week. But do you think that this is for keeps? After all, Qatar and Iran have a very close relationship. They share an oil field. And if you notice, the Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif had a very interesting tweet where he said, and I'm saying it in Hindi, ki theek hai, hum sab bhai hai, chalo hum Shia hai, aap Sunni hai. But I think this is the time for everybody to come together. So what's going on?
I think if I were to stick my neck out, I'd say that maybe you are beginning to see the evolution of MBS from the enfant terrible of the region into a more mature statesperson who is trying to get a lid on local distractions.
Perhaps we should say inshallah to that.
Yes, we should always say that in any case. I think if he's trying to do 2 or 3 things, in my opinion, with this rapprochement. One is that there was a lot of US pressure on the Saudis to put this behind. Ideally, Trump and Kushner would want that the Gulf countries present a somewhat united front against Iran. And given that Biden will be moving forward with his own policy on Iran, which may or may not involve a resuscitation of the nuclear agreement, I think it's useful from their perspective and the Israeli perspective that the Gulfis have a somewhat united position. I'm not saying that Oman or Kuwait or Qatar are going to change their stance towards Iran in a hurry, but at least they are not feuding with each other as openly. The second aspect, I think, is that the Saudis were worried that the emerging Qatar, Turkey, Iran axis, which was now taking up Islamic or Muslim issues quite aggressively, whether it was Israel, whether it is Kashmir, whether it is anywhere else, it erodes Saudi Arabia's position as the voice of the Muslim world in that sense, as the representative of Sunni Islam, at least, if not everybody else. Right. I think MBS wants to regain that position, and taking Qatar out of the equation with Turkey and Iran certainly helps that cause. And finally, I think he is genuinely keen to focus his resources on a very ambitious social and economic reform agenda within the UAE, within the Saudi Arabia itself. And whether it's the Yemen conflict, which they are now trying to bring to some kind of resolution, or it is the Qatar dispute, these are distractions that don't allow him to go forward with the ambitious domestic agenda that he has. Right.
So, Ambassador Wadhwa, Navdeep mentioned Israel, and some weeks ago, a couple of months ago, Israel and the UAE, where Navdeep served, also reopened diplomatic relations. But I want to ask you about the Israeli trade office in Qatar. I mean, it sounds quite fascinating that, again, a few years ago, that the Israelis, anathema to the rest of the Arab world, actually had a trade office in Qatar.
Very true, Jyoti, because that was, when I landed up in Qatar, they were very much there, and they operated out of a hotel over there. Mm-hmm. It's been a strange relationship between Israel and Qatar. So, Qatar really has been accused, and I think rightly so, of supporting Hamas. In fact, a lot of the Hamas leaders were there in Doha at the time that I was there. Initially, I think Israelis
Qatar is supporting Hamas, which is backed by the Iranians, and Israel and Iran have this blood feud going on between them. But Israel has no problems opening a trade office in Qatar. I mean, everybody's talking to everybody in the Arab world. That's clear.
This is one thing about that part of the region. I mean, don't look for predictability and don't look for logic, because you'll find the strangest bedfellows together. And there are various pirouettes in that region which are very difficult to understand. So, you asked me about Israel. So what did happen later was, when this whole thing happened and this blockade of Qatar happened, I think there was a move, I understand, perhaps by some Republican senator to move a resolution in the Hill to say that, to brand Qatar a terrorist state. And it's very funny because there were lobbyists of Israel who opposed it. Mm-hmm. And later we come around to find that Israel actually encourages Qatar to invest in the reconstruction of Gaza. So, these are not zero-sum games. I mean, it's so layered. And similarly, I mean, a lot of what Navdeep says is right. But one interesting thing is actually what happened between the West and Qatar is really a fallout also of the Arab Spring. Because as he says correctly, what happened was that, Qatar felt quite secure. Its own monarchy felt pretty secure. But they actually came out and supported the Arab Spring, whether it was in Egypt, whether it was in Tunisia, in Libya. I think Libya is the greatest example, but they actually went in and they engineered the overthrow of Gaddafi with their troops, with their funds. So there has been, Qatar taking this really very strange stand, which is what I think irritates the others, because it used to be the poorest of the GCC, and because of gas and this sort of, of LNG really, of technology, which had been to convert this gas, their gas fields into LNG. And, you know, countries going in for cleaner fuel and so on, they became the richest country in the world with the highest per capita income. And with that, they tried to buy influence all over the world. And they did buy them a lot of friends. And I think this is what irritates the neighbors, particularly the two larger ones, UAE and Saudi Arabia, who just feel that that Qatar tries all the time to punch much above its weight and succeeds.
Do you agree with that, Ambassador Suri, that Qatar, this tiny little Qatar punching above its weight? But the question on the Arab Spring is an interesting one. Egypt, that was the sort of the foundation of the Arab Spring. I'm sure Egyptians want much more democracy than they have. So what happens when like you said, that MBS or Saudi Arabia is insecure about its own position as the leader of the Arab world, or the Islamic world, shall we say, the Islamic Ummah?
Yeah, I think the Arab Spring was a case of a revolution against the status quo. Whether it was Ben Ali in Tunisia or Mubarak in Egypt, but without a roadmap of what you do after you brought down the existing regime. For many of us, it was pretty clear that it's a pattern that you saw across these countries, that whether it was Mubarak or Ben Ali or others, they had pretty much shut the door for any other opposition. Mm-hmm. When you do that, the only space left for opposition to coalesce is the mosque. Right. And that's where the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt or the Nahda in Tunisia were able to take advantage, that the mosques gave them the platform to organize. And so it was a bit of a no-brainer that if you have a free and fair election, which Egypt by and large did, and the traditional opposition parties, whether it was the Wafd or the others, had been shut out, then the Muslim Brotherhood would claim that space. It's not that the majority of the population necessarily supports an Islamist agenda, but where are the options, where are the alternatives? And so Qatar very smartly, I think, saw that and said, this is my way to get influence into the largest Arab country. By supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. And of course, there were shockwaves in Saudi Arabia and UAE. In UAE, for example, in some of the northern Emirates, Ras Al Khaimah and so on, there was a very large percentage of Egyptian teachers who were sort of Muslim Brotherhood members. And within a couple of years, UAE had expelled something like 40,000 of them because of Muslim Brotherhood sympathies. They did not want the radical or the Muslim Brotherhood agenda of political Islam to be preached in Emirati schools and institutions. Now the lines are drawn even sharper, because Emiratis, for example, have made a foreign policy agenda of promoting religious tolerance. Right? They have a minister for religious tolerance. They have had the Pope and the Sheikh of Al-Azhar sign a document on human fraternity. They are doing this House of Abraham, which will have a synagogue, a mosque, and a church within the same compound, etc., etc., etc. They are doing all
of a huge temple as well.
And a huge temple as well. So they want to make so the Emiratis have clearly evolved from a point of Abu Dhabi being a very conservative Islamic society to one which today says it's okay to have kosher restaurants, in Burj Khalifa. So in that, the lines with Qatar, which continues to support the more conservative Islamic groups, becomes even sharper. And the Emiratis have said, Muslim Brotherhood is also a terrorist group. Right? The Saudis and the Egyptians and the Emiratis are the only three countries in the world which treats Muslim Brotherhood not as a political religious organization, but as a terrorist organization. Right. And you are seeing some of these proxy battles spill over not only into Libya, as Deepa mentioned, but into Sudan, into Somalia, into other places where the Saudi Emirati coalition is happier supporting an authoritarian but quote-unquote secular regime like Haftar in Libya, than to allow space for an Islamist group.
Right. So last couple of questions to you, Ambassador Wadhwa. I do want to ask you once again about Iran. I know that it came up earlier in our discussion, but what happens to Iran now? Is Qatar going to dump Iran because it's returned to the Arab world?
Most unlikely, Jyoti. They share the second largest gas field in the world. But it's interesting how things have evolved. At the time that I was there, I think Qatar's largest threat perception, security threat perception, came from Iran. And perhaps what has happened over time, the actions of UAE and Saudi have actually perhaps pushed them into Iranian arms. There were concerns that they had at that point of time. There's another very interesting part of it. As I said, I don't think they've given on any of Qatar has not given in on any of those demands that were made of them. I do not see, relations with Iran being affected in any sort of way. In fact, while this blockade was on for their food security, and Qatar just, grows about 1% of its food needs. I think it was Turkey and Iran who came in to a lesser extent us, because of course our population in Indians make a very large percentage of the population in Qatar, who helped them at this point of time. So I don't really see a change in that. But interestingly, I was reading somewhere that Iran stands to lose some amount of money because since the Qatar Airways was forced to use Iranian airspace, apparently they had to pay a lot to be able to use their airspace. And now that the rest have opened up their airspace, apparently there'll be some loss of funding, money that Iran was getting. But I see no change there at all, honestly. It's also, you do find an influential Shia group, very little talked about in Qatar. So Qatar is a Wahhabi state, as is Saudi Arabia. In fact, you'd expect the two Wahhabi states in the region to have much closer relations than they have. But this relationship, I think, is just because of proximity, security needs, and a variety of other things. I don't think it will be affected.
So I also want to talk about, and I can't let you both go without talking about the Taliban talks that are taking place in Doha. So how does Qatar invite the Islamic, the so-called Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, basically a lot of them Guantanamo returnees, some other Taliban guys who also lived in the Quetta Shura in Pakistan, in Karachi. So to both of you, Navdeep, to you first.
The Americans are quite happy that they should rather be in Qatar than in Guantanamo or anywhere else, right?
But why not the UAE? Why didn't the other countries in the Arab world who believe that the self-proclaimed leaders like Saudi and the UAE, why not have them? After all, Saudi, the UAE recognized the Taliban when it was in power in Afghanistan from 96 to 2001. So why didn't they then just open an office there?
And probably realized that was a mistake at that time. As I said, there's really been a genuine evolution in the approach of UAE, and under, I think, some influence from UAE in Saudi Arabia as well, towards how Islam is seen from a political perspective. So to the UAE of today, the Taliban are as retrograde as the Al-Qaeda are or others are. And remember, the UAE ambassador in Afghanistan was killed in a terrorist attack, along with several key members of their aid mission. And the Emiratis haven't forgiven either the Taliban and to an extent the Pakistanis, because they're still trying to figure out who pulled the trigger on that particular case. So there's no love lost between the Emiratis and the Taliban. And I think that's where we need to recognize that the situation that prevailed in 2001 isn't what it is in 2021. These are shifting sands, and in this case, they've really shifted.
Absolutely. Ambassador Wadhwa, what do you think about the Taliban being in Qatar?
Well, Jyoti, when this started, I was there, when the talk of a Taliban office being opened in the region was happening. And I recall that there was competition between the UAE and Qatar to host it. My own feeling was, I think the Afghan government at that point would have much rather had it been in the UAE rather than in Doha. But perhaps, again, at that point of time, also the Qataris came in with far more liberal funding and what have you. And perhaps Americans also, supported the Qataris in this for whatever reason it was at that point of time. So that's how it came to be. And initially it was set up, and then for a while it was very quiet. And then, of course, as you know, what has happened now. But Qatar has been able to play this game with different groups. And, this is really the amazing part of its foreign policy. I mean, there is absolutely no line that you can draw. And at some point of time, you find them with Islamists. The other time, you find them, on the other side, with the Shias, with the Sunnis. And there's one very interesting, thing which I wanted to mention as to why this broke out in June of 2017. One of the reasons for the blockade was just 2 months before that, 26 members of the Qatari royal family had been kidnapped somewhere in the Iraq-Syria region. And apparently, Qatar paid a huge ransom both to Shia and Sunni militants. That's what's interesting, of about $1 billion to get them out. And this was something which irritated, really angered rather, both the Saudis and the Emiratis, saying that this kind of encouraged the militants. And this was one of the reasons also for this blockade.
Well, fascinating stuff, shifting lines in shifting sands. We haven't talked about the US role as much on the Middle East or the Arab world, but even otherwise, I think it's so many layers, like you both explained. And also, External Affairs Minister Mr. Jaishankar has been in Qatar recently, but perhaps we leave that for another day. Thank you so much, Ambassador Deepa Gopalan Wadhwa, Ambassador Navdeep Suri, for joining me on the print discussions, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jyoti. Enjoyed that.